Let's say you're omnipotent and you want to make a clock. There are two ways to do it. The first way would be to create a dial with hands that always point in the right direction in response to the actual time. The big hand would move around the dial once every hour, always landing on the 12 at the same exact moment as the little hand arrives at whatever o'clock it is, simply because you commanded it to. You would either command it to follow that pattern for all eternity, or else you could dedicate a small part of your infinite mind to physically moving it according to that pattern. There would be nothing of what we would call clockworks inside, just a giant cosmic miracle dial responding to your decree on its own. The second way would be to build it with all the wheels inside meshing together, timed by the flywheel, driven by the power source, working with utmost precision, ensuring that the hands point in the right numbers on the dial at the right time of the cosmic time progression. Any addition you made later would be powered by and in sync with the existing clockworks. It would be designed to work all on its own without any effort from you, except you could add an input device whereby you could make any corrections, such as increase speed by 1/millionth of a second, etc., etc. We'll talk more about that input device later. From reviewing all the evidence, both from science and the Bible, I'd have to conclude that a certain omnipotent being that we know chose the second of the two ways, the clockworks model, when creating the universe. A lot of folk religion does seem to favor the miracle dial method, as well as perhaps a few early scientific models. However, even early scientists as Aristotle and others lean towards the direction of the clockwork style of universe. Religious sources are also ambiguous. While the phrase, "in him all things consist," could be interpreted as supporting the first option, there are also passages that indicate that the heavenly bodies are there for times and seasons, staying on their courses on their various circuits, having a cause-effect relationship with the conditions on the earth. As one passage says, "So long as the earth exists, sowing time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night will not cease." That's Genesis 8:22. While the other nations worship the sun, the moon, various other forces of nature, assuming that there was a different God directly controlling each of these forces, the sweep of biblical revelation generally discourages that belief, suggesting instead that these were non-intelligent but powerful forces set in motion at the beginning by God, following their natural rhythms and cycles, naturally affecting the earth. Even if the scriptures don't say so explicitly, they do give humanity a firm push in that direction. In other words, the weather is warm today, not because Ra or Apollo decided to emanate their essence more powerfully, while the gods of rain kindly decided to stand aside, but because the non-intelligent forces of nature are simply following their natural course. And how does science point to a clockwork model? There are the four forces that we know of: gravitational, electrical, magnetic, the strong and the weak. We know that atoms consist of dozens of types of particles, each rendering possible various facets of our existence, including life. Though we've always taken it for granted, actual life integrated with physical substance isn't an easy thing to come by. We know that rocks can't be living. Minerals can't hold life, nor can any other element or simple compound, although we now have very complex electronic circuitry with just the right programming to make it act like it's alive. Isn't that right, Alexa?
That's right.
But only the extremely intricate structure of the DNA molecule can actually hold life. We still don't know how it works, nor how to recreate it. All we can do is grow it from existing DNA. When God said, "Let there be light," the Big Bang occurred at just the right intensity to divide that initial microscopic speck into a humongous mass of photons, all at the right intensity to enable the formation of atoms of every size and type, the clockworks that would eventually enable life. Had that Big Bang been even the slightest more intense, the physicists tell us, all that would have been enabled would have been the hydrogen atoms. Life could never come about. Anything ever so slightly less intense, and the universe as we know it, again, still would not have been possible. Even at the right intensity, the time still had to be right. The Omnipotent One said, "Let light be separated from darkness." Ripples appeared in the outward flowing stream of light, and gravitational and magnetic forces began to go to work at pulling it together to form galaxies and stars. The nuclear reaction within each star formed the various particles into atoms, splitting them again, completely dissolving them and remaking them into atoms again, while some that had spun off beyond the outer periphery formed into planets. When at least one planet had cooled off sufficiently, God said, "Let the water be separated from dry land, and let an atmosphere be formed." Only then was life even possible. We are told we are living in what is called the Goldilocks zone, where it is like Junior Bear's porridge, just right. So, how much time passed between these events that led to being in just right for life of any sort to make its appearance? Some say billions of years, others say a few days. The thing about such intense gravitational force as was present at the Big Bang is that it greatly sped up time, so that the first couple of aeons could have been a couple of days. To God, that doesn't make any difference anyhow, as a day and 1,000 years, or a billion as far as that goes, are all the same. It was all a part of fixing the clockworks to accommodate life, and setting it up that relatively short Goldilocks zone where humanity could live and roam and fulfill his destiny. There is reason to believe that at least the seventh day of creation was much longer than 24 hours. According to Hebrews 4:3-11, we are still in the seventh day. God has been resting, and it remains for some of us to enter that rest. So God told man on the sixth day, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that crawls on the earth." God gave his creation over to humanity for safekeeping, set his alarm clock, and rested. Well, okay, he isn't exactly sleeping. Remember, there is that input device whereby he can make adjustments, and that is through interaction with humanity, to whom he gave the authority to manage things. That input device is, in fact, the life that he breathed into man that brought him to life. So humanity is both a product of the grand universal clockworks that God had spent so much time in designing and developing, and alive with the breath of God himself. Where other creatures are simply products of the clockworks, and therefore subject to determinism, humanity is above that and is capable of true creativity, making decisions that can't be predicted by knowing all the maths. So humanity, created in God's own image, holding God's life in his DNA, both belongs to the physical universe that produced that DNA and transcends it. He is a higher order of being, meant to be God's own friend. That's who God gave authority over his creation. But we also know that the first couple of humans blew it, creating a mess with a capital M, that all humans coming after have had to live with. So God has been making heavy use of that input device. Everyone is affected by the mess, some more than others, and in different ways, prompting some to say, "It just isn't fair." There's nothing about the mess that's fair. Some are enslaved, bullied, tortured, slaughtered, bereaved, left desolate, while others reap the benefits of living high off other people's suffering, all because of how human nature has been skewed. Early humans took on board something that they were told not to, and that gave them an acute sense of good and evil. On the surface, that sounds good, but look closer. What it was an obsession to compare everything. The first humans looked at each other and then at themselves and said, "Your body is beautiful, but mine? Oh my God, stop looking at me." To this day, we think of nudity as evil, but God made it clear that that's only because we think it is, when he said, "Who told you you were naked?" Later, somebody said to his brother, "You are better than me, so God loves you more than me, therefore I hate you." That led to the first murder. Later still, people began saying, "Sex with you is nice, but I could have a better time with someone else, more beautiful than or more handsome than you." and you have a prettier woman than I have, a stronger beast of burden, nicer tools, and more land than I have, but I'm stronger than you, so I'm taking it. Actually, the basic desires aren't bad in themselves. A healthy sex drive is a good thing, and some desires and urges are simply survival instincts. It's when we're obsessed with comparing the quality of or quantity with what others have that it gets out of proportion. And so, because some are more stronger than others, while following the same skewed logic, we've ended up with an unfair mess that we're in. Now, question and answer time. First, how can a loving God allow these things to happen? The answer. Remember the two possible ways for the omnipotent being to build a clock. Had he chosen the miracle dial method, that would be a very good question. If everything worked simply because he had his hand on it, making it work, then everything would be run perfectly, and all the aforementioned evils would not be happening. But he didn't do it that way. He went with the clockworks model, designing the universe to run according to the laws of physics and quantum mechanics in a cause-effect continuum. Moreover, because humanity is a transcendent being, as well as an integral part of the clockworks, we had the power to skew things up on a grand scale, which we did. Then why didn't the omnipotent one do something about that before it got out of hand? Keep in mind the nature of the universe he made, the clockworks, the careful timing, the laws of physics and the quantum mechanics, and all the preparation that went into the Goldilocks zone. It is clear that God took no shortcuts. All of that work went into the preparation of humanity's place in the vast clockworks of the universe as a functioning part of the clockworks. So let's rephrase that question. Why didn't the omnipotent one do something he had never done since detonating the Big Bang, and stick his finger into the clockworks, stop the universe, undo the human mistake, and then start it off where it left off? That's not his way. He had already put humanity into the pilot seat, had begun his day of rest. Humanity was given freedom of choice, and with that comes living with those choices. Free will is a dangerous thing. Perhaps the next obvious question would be, wasn't God morally wrong in giving humanity the free will when he knew where it would lead? There are many angles to that one. Part of the assumption is that it was like entrusting the keys of the family car to a young child. Others picture it as setting a bowl of sweets on the table and telling a 2-year-old, don't touch. The way the Adam and Eve story is often told, one quite easily comes away with that conclusion. However, if we examine the account more carefully, we might get a far different picture. The first man had already named the animals, and according to rabbinical tradition, used sounds that matched the nature of each creature, like a well-studied Kabbalist would. So, was Adam no more than a small child? Perhaps more like a father entrusting the keys of the car to a son nearing adulthood, who already knew how to drive safely and responsibly, and had already proven himself on many occasions. The son is ready, by everyone's standards, to be trusted with such a potentially dangerous machine. But he still messes up at the critical moment, causing death and destruction. Who is morally responsible for that? That leads to another angle. Why was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil there in the first place? One thing we don't pretend to know is what ultimate purpose it served. There are a few theories, such as maybe it was meant for later on, after humanity had matured to a certain level, or that it was simply there to test humanity's obedience, or as a chance to exercise his power to choose. Perhaps none of them completely satisfies everyone. But there is another consideration. Adam, as we observed, had been there longer, knew what was what, and knew what he was doing. Eve was the new arrival, and so she was easily deceived. When Adam discovered that Eve had eaten the forbidden fruit, why didn't he take Eve by the hand and lead her to where God would be walking in the cool of the day and say, I'm afraid we've had a mishap. Eve has eaten of that tree you told us not to eat because the snake told her it was good for her. Isn't there anything that can be done for her? He didn't do that. He simply ate of it himself, knowing full well what consequences were, And people point to the Genesis story to show how superior men are to women. How is that superior? Yet another angle is, would it really have been better to be products of determinism than free will? If we were, would we be enjoying the levels of creativity that we do, pushing the limits of what's possible, or indeed even discussing free will versus determinism? It's clear from a close examining of Scripture that God's intent in creating humanity was to enjoy a companionship on that level. It's on that level that we see that God, by making use of the input device, initiated a mid-course correction intended to eventually bring everything back into line with what it was supposed to be. As anyone knows who fixes things, some fixes may take a while, and in mid-fix may even look worse than when it started out. That fix, with a capital F, involved instituting a covenant with various ones, which gave the omnipotent one leeway to manifest his omnipotence in a limited way, things like parting the Red Sea, etc., without overstepping the mandate he had given humanity. In fact, that was the whole point of having the chosen people, so he could legally maintain a presence on the earth, so that he could carry out the fix. Humanity created the mess. Humanity must play a vital role in the fix. What about those who have been suffering in the meantime, simply because the fix is still in the works? What about those who have never heard of the fix? The traditional assertion is that every man, woman, boy, girl, puppy, and kitten who hasn't read aloud the sinner's prayer from the back of a chick tract will spend all of eternity burning in the intense fire of hell. Doesn't matter how miserable their life was on earth. I believe there is a hell, and in the world to come, in which the meek shall inherit the earth. I also believe that being fully initiated into God's kingdom is through repentance and faith, and being born again by the Spirit of God. We'll talk about that in another post. However, I also believe it's a mistake to assume that theologians have distilled the sum of all truth from what little we can glean from Scriptures. I do believe God is just, and besides being omnipotent, he is all-knowing. He knows the lives of every abused child, every slave, each bullied and beaten vulnerable person, from beginning to end. He is just. I can only trust him with that. That's a part of having faith in him. We do get some big hints from the Bible. The following from Yeshua's parable. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus. A rich man who had everything, but never showed mercy to poor, diseased Lazarus, who sat at the door grabbing what crumbs fell from the dishes as they were being carried out to be washed. Both died. The rich man went to hell, while Lazarus went to a comfortable place and was held at the bosom of Father Abraham. We are not told that Lazarus was a born-again Christian, nor whether he was even Torah observant, only that he was receiving compensation for a life of misery. The rich man was apparently receiving just compensation for non-Torah observance, particularly of those parts of the Torah that command us not to neglect the poor of the land, to see to the needs of the widows and orphans and the refugees, and about consuming the earth's resources without giving anything back. The parable of the sheep and goats. At Judgment Day, the judge of all the earth sits on his throne, directing some to move to his right, others to his left. To those on his right he says, I was sick and you helped me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was in prison and you visited me, etc. Enter into the joy of the Lord. Those people replied, Huh? When did that happen? I've never even been to church. I never saw you. The judge replied, Oh, yes, you did. When you befriended that homeless kid, when you went out of your way to check how that very sick-looking man was doing, when you paid out more than you could afford to feed that family, you were doing it to me. To those on his left, he had other things to say. As I said, the above are hints as to God's criteria for judgment. A major one is according to how we judge. Yeshua said, Don't judge, and you won't be judged. By what standard you judge others is how you will be judged. I picture one of us standing in a queue at the final judgment. The man just 2 ahead of you approaches the throne and says, I was really bad, I know, I had such a bad temper. I beat my wife and kid a couple of times, and the judge interrupts him and says, "Yes, you confess that to me, and by my grace you are beginning to overcome in that area. You were on your way to becoming a truly good and gentle husband and a father before your brother-in-law shot you. You are forgiven. Enter into the joy of the Lord." Then the one just before you approaches and saying, "I'm not sure if I'm worthy to enter. I just couldn't keep my hands on myself. Always flirting. My wife divorced me. But you kept looking to me for forgiveness. You were slowly being transformed by my grace. Enter into my joy." And it's your turn. I can't think of any reason I can't just enter, can you? I mean, I wasn't nearly as bad as those other two, and they... Not so fast. What about that time you went to church wearing that shirt that hadn't been ironed? Or that time when you were picking your nose in front of the city hall? Then there was a time that you bent over to pick up a coin and the top of your bum was showing. She said, "Come on, those are such small things. Those two ahead of me were..." I can't judge you on the same as them. You wrote your own rule book when you judged others by how they conduct themselves in public. So I have to judge you by the same standards you judge them. Maybe not exactly, but you get the picture. James says that in his epistle that by fulfilling the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves, instead of judging and favoring some over others, we qualify ourselves to be assessed by the royal law of liberty. This brings us to our biggest obstacle. By taking on board the knowledge of good and evil, we've made ourselves experts in judging others, and that, in turn, subjects us to judgment. By showing mercy, giving people the benefit of the doubt, forgiving personal offenses, releasing grudges, we place ourselves under God's mercy. However, we can't simply unknow the knowledge of good and evil, can we? As much as we try to forgive and forget, it always just keeps coming back. Also, some wounds are so deep, we find it impossible to forgive. That's where we really need the fix. Just as the mess was created by humanity, so also was the fix in the person of Messiah Yeshua. The Omnipotent One had been spending all of human history setting it up so that he, by human consent and cooperation, could send the fix in the person of his Son, the human Jesus. After spending a lifetime telling us about the fix, Yeshua himself became the target of every injury, abuse, slander, false accusation, and was finally subjected unjustly to the most torturous death imaginable, absorbing the shock of all human injustice while uttering his last words, "Father, forgive them." As a human, Yeshua had the authority of a human, but without the setback of having gone wrong. He expended all the energy that he had been given and all the authority that he had until there was no more to expend. The intensity was such that he underwent death. Thus, the perfect exercise of human authority, completely undoing the mess, making the fix available to all of humanity. So what exactly was it that this perfect exercise of human authority enabled the Omnipotent One to do? Something along the line of what he did with the first human, when he breathed into him the breath of life. It was so powerful that it brought him back to life, complete with his body, but in a highly enhanced state. What's more, because it was officially enabled by human authority, and it has a potential to affect all humans, solving all the world's problems, eventually bringing resurrection from the dead in the same enhanced state. It's a force greater than any of us can imagine, and it's been in our hands ever since. So what's wrong? We're like a bunch of kids sitting on the top of a machine, more powerful than a nuclear reactor, but we're fighting over a game of marbles. Isn't that just like us? So now the fix is in place. It's there in the clockworks, but it's still up to humanity to apply it. That's what we're on about now, some of us anyway. In our next video, we'll go more into what all this means. There are some aspects of the Old Testament that beg some serious questions, somehow glossed over in Sunday school, which we'll also take a second look at. The title is How the Omnipotent One Used Politically Incorrect Methods to Correct the Universe. We'll also see where it all leads. Meanwhile, feel free to visit me on my website, robbycharters.co.uk. That's my name spelled with a Y. My mother had me spell it that way. Charters. You'll find some more of my stuff. I have a few novels, including a graphic novel that I've just finished, and soon, hopefully, a few more of these videos. Anyway, until next time.